In the 60s and 70s, BMC threw its engineering might at creating small, distinctive family saloon cars to sit just above the Mini and stand out in the marketplace amongst a slew of more conventional Fords and Vauxhalls. In the 60s, we got the ADO 16, and in the 70s, the infamous Austin Allegro. But both these classics are getting a very strong following these days, and yet both remain resolutely affordable. So if you fancy a compact, unusual and classy classic British saloon, which should you go for? Let's find out. It's fair to say the Mini had been quite a success for BMC the world over, but if truth be told, it wasn't really a family car. Yes, it could fit 4 people and their luggage in it, but you had to be friendly. So Issigonis was told to create the same basic principles, but in a bigger, more family-oriented package. And the project was codenamed Amalgamated Design Office Project 16, or ADO 16 for short. Now, noting the success of creating really exotic, pretty family cars like the A40 Farina, Pininfarina was commissioned to design the ADO 16. And what a triumph it was. This is a cracking looking little car. It's got really nice proportions, those lovely fins at the back. It's dainty, it's elegant, and it makes good use of its size without appearing dumpy or overly swollen. It's tight and it's neat, and it's got some real glamour to it. You can imagine putting a Alfa Romeo or a Lancia badge on this. It's an extremely pretty little car, and to my eyes it's far better looking than any Mini ever was, but feel free to fight about that one in the comments. Being an Issigonis project though, the ADO 16 was going to be far more than a looker. It was going to be well engineered and advanced as well. For a start, it used the same A-series engine as the Mini, and that meant there was the gearbox in the sump right at the front, and that maximised the cabin space. And to make that cabin space go all that much further, it also had a very low floor, which meant it was easy to get in and out of, and it maximised legroom and headroom. And it had a very low belt line, which meant you've got a huge glass house, and that makes it feel really roomy and spacious in here, especially for what, when you look at the back, it's not actually an enormous car. It's smaller than a modern Fiesta. Being an A-series, of course, the engine was transversely mounted, and that meant this car had front-wheel drive, which again meant more space in the cabin without a big transmission tunnel going down the middle, taking up space. It also got front disc brakes as standard, which means if you stamp on it, it stops on its nose, and it got the all-new hydroelastic suspension, which was definitely one up from the Mini's rubber cones affair. Hydroelastic suspension uses fluid-filled displacer units in place of springs and shocks, which are interconnected front to rear. Each displacer contains a rubber spring, and displaced fluid passes through the rubber valves to achieve a damping effect. The displaced fluid is transferred to the paired wheel, and when a front wheel encounters a bump, fluid is transferred to the corresponding rear displacer, which lowers the rear wheel, lifting the rear up and minimising the pitch caused by bumps. So what does it all add up to? Well, the result is a small family saloon car that rides remarkably well. It's got a bit of bounciness to it, but it's incredibly well damped. It's not throwing you around. Even in this sporty 1300 GT, you've got some nice comfortable seats, and it takes bumps remarkably well. It doesn't judder and hop and skip around them like a Mini does. It floats over them remarkably well for such a small car, and because it's got the wheels at all 4 corners, it's chuckable as well. Here on the roads at Drive Dad's car, you can fling this little thing around. The steering's responsive, lovely weight to it, and you can just dodge potholes with aplomb. Adding to it the lightweight and the compact dimensions, and it really does encourage you to fling it around into a roundabout here, feel it grip. Oh yes! It feels so planted because it's low and wide. It spreads its weight out well. It is great fun to chuck around here. It's got that real spirit of the Mini, but it's just that much more refined. It's not jostling me in my seat. And actually, if I want to slow down to a cruise, pop it into 4th gear here, it'll just cruise. It can do the comfortable thing, but then I can change down and throw it around like a Mini driving hooligan. Haha! After less than 3 years of development, the ADO 16 launched in 1962, and BMC were very clever with this car. To maximise its appeal, it wore every badge pretty much in the BMC stable. Gradually you could buy an Austin, a Morris, an MG, you could buy a Wolseley, a Riley, you could get sporting variants, luxury variants, you could even get more powerful twin carb models, you could get upmarket versions. There was something for everyone. It really did maximise this car's appeal and make it one car for all purposes. Over the years you could get a 2-door version, a 4-door or an estate, and that meant there really was no customer that couldn't be satisfied by some variant of ADO 16. And from the very start at launch, the base model was just £150 more expensive than a Mini for a car that was bigger, more spacious, comfier, more upmarket. and also more usable. So frankly, not only was it well engineered and pretty, but it was good value. And unsurprisingly, the press loved the ADO 16 as well. They loved its style, its comfort, its practicality, fun driving experience, great fuel economy, and good value considering its rivals. And it continued to evolve as well. In 1967 came the Mark II with the 1275cc A series, and then later you could get this Austin 1300 GT model, which really does go well. That is great fun, and it goes as well as pretty much any sporting Mini of the period. Oh, this is tremendous. Lovely little warble under the bonnet, down into second, fling it in. Yes. And it quickly became one of the most iconic and best loved British family cars ever. In fact, even today you'll see examples of it. It was used as the base model to be used on road signs, and that means on signs like the one that show you there's deep water you could drive into, the basic car outline you see is one of an ADO 16. That's how synonymous this car became with British families on the road. In short, the ADO 16 was BMC doing everything right. By taking its time and throwing all its brain and all its abilities at a car, it created something that was stylish, capable, well refined and lovable, and sold in its millions. This is truly one of the best cars for me to come out of BMC and Leyland, and today it remains one of the best little British classics you can get into, often at a fraction of the price of a Mini. But there was one problem. The all-important fleet market never really took to the ADO 16. They didn't particularly like its foreign Italian styling, its weird hydroelastic suspension, and its unconventional front-wheel drive transverse layout. They continued to buy the more conventional and much more simple Ford Cortina in its millions instead. So what BMC needed to do then was meet both briefs, something modern and advanced and forward-thinking for the general public buyer, but also something conventional and normal for the fleet market. But hoping to occupy both spots, BMC decided to diversify. They launched the Morris Marina later to become the conventional normal saloon for the fleet buyers. But what could they replace the ADO 16 with that was just as radical and forward-thinking and exciting? Ah, the Austin Allegro, the butt of pretty much all British motor industry jokes. But let's go back a bit and delve into the history of this car. Obviously, as we've said, BMC needed both a conventional replacement for the ADO 16 to compete against the Cortina in the fleet market, which was the Morris Marina that we've covered before, and then something radical and forward-thinking and modern and interesting to appeal to the private buyer. And the Allegro would be the latter. For a start, rather than getting Pininfarina to design it, they got Harris Mann, who'd done a rather fantastic job, or would go on to do, with cars like the Princess and the TR7. And when you look at Harris Mann's concept sketches for what became known as the Allegro, it looks fantastic. It's low, it's sleek, it's sharp, it's futuristic, and it's got more than a hint of Citroen GS about it. It looks tremendous. However, he was rather hamstrung by the engines that the Allegro would be using. Rather than develop an all-new low engine like the flat 4 that Citroen put in the GS, the Allegro would be using the existing gearbox sump A series and then the E series, and those were tall engines because they had the gearbox in the sump, and that meant that they had to raise the bonnet line to accommodate it without it punching through the bonnet over big bumps, and that meant that everything was thrown out of proportion, because with a high bonnet line you then needed a higher waistline, you needed a bigger glass house, and then the roof had to be taller, and then it didn't look long enough, so the car had to be made longer and it had to be made wider. And the end result was you went from this really sleek, low-slung, futuristic-looking concept to a car that was dumpy and wide and downright awkward looking, frankly. There are still some nice details in the Allegro's design, the front grille, but then you look further and find that it doesn't even have all the features it should. For a start, the Austin Maxi was to be the hatchback prodigy of BMC, and that meant that despite looking like it should have a hatchback, the Allegro is a saloon, which of course hampered its practicality and means it looks weird. And indeed, the old jokes about it being more aerodynamic going backwards than forwards aren't actually true, but you can believe it just looking at that weird teardrop rear end. It's a real shame because there are some nice details in this, and personally I still quite like the way the Allegro looks, but it could have been so much more. And next to sharp stuff like the Citroen GS and just Italian chicness that is the Alfa Sud, it really is the British poor relation. And sadly, that unfortunate unattractiveness extended inside as well. The early Allegros were fitted with the infamous square steering wheel, which was more compact than a traditional circular one and was said to offer better legroom because you could get your knees either side of it. But not only did it look weird, but it didn't go with anything because of course all the dials and switchgear was rounded, but also it made it horrible to use. Going around a roundabout, for example, meant really awkward shuffling, the likes of which you wouldn't see until Tesla put that weird yoke on their car recently, but the less said about that the better. It was quickly and quietly dropped because the square steering wheel, while it's seen as a cool artifact of the day today, just isn't very good, sadly, and you do have to rob Peter to pay Paul as far as the ergonomics are concerned. Then there was the suspension. Could you use traditional coil springs and shock absorbers like the Cortina? No, of course not. This was the modern, forward-thinking part of the BMC saloon lineup. But nor did it use the hydroelastic setup from the ADO 16. In fact, the Allegro used another new setup known as Hydrogas.
Hydrogas suspension, meanwhile, uses a combination of pressurised gas and hydraulic fluid. It allows for dynamic suspension adjustment as more or less pressure is applied by the severity of bumps in the road. Like hydroelastic, the spheres are interconnected front to rear, allowing the wheels to make each other aware of bumps and adjust accordingly, which means the Allegro literally floats along.
And unfortunately, that too lacked appeal. The fleet wouldn't touch it, something so unconventional that had to be regularly pumped up for fear of it deflating and leaving the car on its nose or awkwardly leaning to one side, and even the regular public buyers weren't sure that some suspension that couldn't just be simply replaced was really for them. So unfortunately, this brilliant concept never really took off. But there are benefits to Hydrogas. For a start, it doesn't blow out nearly as easily of big hard bumps that we have a lot of in Britain as a conventional shock absorber does. And when you're driving over a rutted surface, it is fantastically comfortable. We're driving at Drive Dad's car here in Matlock, we've got this slightly rutted bit here, just floating over it. I'm not going to pretend it's hydro-pneumatic Citroen levels of comfortable, but it does float remarkably well for such a compact car on what isn't actually using fully fluid-based suspension. It's rather relaxing, and of course in the luxurious Van den Plas model they produced, it was even softer and comfier. You could make an argument for that car being the working class Rolls Royce, I suppose. And these lovely plush seats, even when Lucas got in here to set the cameras up for this video, even he commented on how comfy the seats are, and indeed, it is like being in a big, comfy armchair at your nan's house. It is a comfier place to be than the likes of a Mini, or if I'm honest, than the ADO 16. Sadly though, there was yet more bad news to come for the Allegro. For a start, it was built at peak British Leyland trouble time, and that meant not only was it rarely being built, such was the quantity and quality of industrial action going on, but when it was being built, it wasn't being built to a very high standard, and that meant not only did you have hydrogas issues, but you had unreliability, you had trim falling off, and rust in just a few short years. That unfortunately earned it the nickname or aggro, and sadly that's a reputation this car never really managed to shake off. The Allegro 2 later updated a few bits and pieces, and it did improve the quality and refine it more, but sadly a good reputation takes a minute to lose and a lifetime to recover from, and the Allegro never really pulled it off. Such was of course the issues with the hydrogas and that dumpy styling. But behind that poor reputation and all that slagging off and all the mocking and the jokes and lazy journalists calling it the worst car ever made, what's the Austin Allegro actually like to drive? Well, actually really rather nice. As we've said, it's comfortable, it does soak up the bumps nicely. The engine, it goes well, it's got really strong performance. This is the sport model, it's worth pointing out, but it does go well, and yet it's more refined than the ADO 16. It's got more sound insulation, it's got a better ride, and actually it steers just as well despite having that gas-based suspension. It brakes well, and even if you really chuck it into a corner, I wouldn't call that much understeer, and I wouldn't really call it much body roll either, considering this is ultimately a family saloon car. It doesn't feel as light on its feet as the ADO 16, nor as nimble. I wouldn't say it's as much fun, but it's more refined, it's a more grown-up option, shall we say. And you know what? For a 70s classic to cruise around in, this is every bit as pleasant as any Cortina or Cavalier I've driven. There's a lot to be said for this, actually. And as a place to be, it's nice as well. It's roomy, I've got a nice low floor, I've got loads of headroom, and the space in the back is plentiful as well. You could easily put 4 adults in this, and it's a nice dashboard layout. It's simple, it's logical, I can reach all the controls easily, got a good level of equipment. There's a lot to be said for this as a family saloon car, and yet is that bit more different and more interesting than a simple basic Cavalier or Cortina, and certainly than the utterly conventional Morris Marina. But leave your piano comments at the door for that one. Ultimately, and sadly, I think the Allegro was on an uphill struggle from day one, because it was aimed at targeting something as radical and as high-tech and advanced as the Citroen GS or the Alfa Sud, and yet it was developed on half the budget of the Morris Marina. And that's a car that, don't forget, used Morris Minor underpinnings and was meant to be simple and conventional. And for this radical forward-thinking car to have half that budget, it was always going to be a struggle. But drive a nice example today like this one at Drive Dad's Car, and you can see the genius hidden in it. You can see the appeal. You can see how much thought and clever engineering went into making the Allegro, and you can see how close it was to being a real world-class effort, the likes of which would compete with the GS or the Alfa Sud. It was that close. It might lack quite the final polish of some of its European rivals, and today you can't escape that poor reputation that it's got. But in my book, the All Aggro is all right. Hello. Well, it's funny how two cars can be so different and yet so similar. Distinctive styling, unique suspension, broadly similar engines, A-series in both cases in fact, and yet have totally different characters. And there's a lot to be said for both of these cars. When it comes down to which you prefer, I think it's going to be a generational thing. Really, the older of you will probably prefer the ADO 16, and if you are a 70s kid, you might end up preferring the Allegro, in spite of all the terrible comments and all the naysaying about it. First of all, it's worth pointing out the Allegro is an awful lot better than you've heard. It's not a bad car by any means, and most of the bad examples have gone by now, and a good one, like this, is a great classic in its own right, and still very affordable, distinctive, charming, and very nice to drive, every bit as good as any Cortina of the same age. But for me, the one that tugs at the heartstrings, the one that you'd keep looking back at, and the one that you'd take out for a drive for fun, is the ADO 16. I know this is a 1300 GT, but make no mistake, any trim, Austin, Morris, MG, whatever, will be a great fun classic to drive. I love the way they look. They've got a real charm, a real character, and they're still distinctive and yet cheaper than a Mini in pretty much all guises. And what's more, this is one of those rare cases of BMC and Leyland where rather than being what might have been, it's what was, and that should be celebrated for the brilliant car that it resulted in. But let us know down in the comments below, which of these cars, ADO 16 or Allegro, would you choose? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for all future Classics World content. Do check our playlist on the channel for all other BMC and Leyland videos we've done, and we'll see you again soon. Right, I'm off for one more drive. I'm going to drive right in the back of Paul Wage's shot here at the Ruin It. And then nearly run Lucas over. Hello. Right, here we go then.